I mentioned before in a previous video that I wanted to do a longer form discussion of something that I brought up, which was that you don't need to make your story, your science fiction or fantasy story, able to withstand every possible criticism of its logic. And a big part of that is because at the end of the day, no story is immune to criticism about its logic. Everybody can nitpick something. Anybody out there can sit down with your story and find a problem with it, and they will. The point is to look for the biggest things that run the risk of directly undermining the premise that you've constructed. It's not to try and make the story 100% watertight and immune to all forms of deconstruction. And I think this is something that plagues science fiction and fantasy authors pretty heavily because they tend to be preoccupied with how things are put together in their story. Does my world building make sense? Does my magic system make sense? Or, just even on the level of character motivation. And I'll say that it's probably a lot easier to debug character motivation than it is to debug a world or a magic system that has its flaws. Because most of us, I think, are much more intimately familiar with how characters can make sense as human beings. That if we watch something and we scratch our heads and we say, why did they do that? That's totally out of character based on what they've seen. That's a gut feeling. That's something most of us are attuned to. The vast majority of us are not as readily attuned to world building that isn't internally cohesive because we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that. And by us, I'm referring to, just lay audiences, not necessarily people who are self-consciously writing science fiction or fantasy or self-consciously consuming those things. When you're writing science fiction or fantasy, I think one of the most important things is to know how much work to do to get things to hold together just enough to keep the audience with you. You want the audience to be engaged. You want them to basically say yes to your story. And you don't want them to push the eject button over something that seems trivial. Now, this is not something you are ever going to have 100% control over. You're going to have people that are going to abandon your work for any number of stupid reasons. Now, when I say stupid, I mean what seems stupid to you, not what seems stupid to the reader. The reader's motives are always going to make perfect sense to them. It is going to be perfectly sensible for them to abandon a book because they don't like the fact that a character is named a particular way or something like that. There are any number of things that can rub a reader the wrong way. The point is not to try and please everybody, but the point is to try and eliminate as many of the biggest, most obvious mistakes that you could make. The point is to keep you from blowing your own toes off, not from, nicking a finger. And I also feel like science fiction and fantasy authors, more than a lot of other authors, get preoccupied with this need to make everything watertight because that's one of the ways that they feel proudest about the work, that it makes internal sense, that the world building has built a world, that it holds together on its own terms. And honestly, that's only half the picture. If I'm reading a book that has really well thought out world building, but on the other hand is not really very much of a story, then I'm essentially reading an atlas. I'm not really reading a story. I'm not reading about people who are engaged in something that I am curious about seeing all the way through to the end. That should be the main thing. And it's genuinely hard to do that. It's in fact probably much harder to do that than it is to make something that is internally cohesive according to its own logic. You only want to go so far with this sort of thing. You only want to go so far before you finally just wave your hands and say, okay, this is airtight enough. This is solid enough. I'm going to build my story on top of this. Everything from this point forward is going to have to be carried by the story and the people in it, because that's what most people are going to find themselves invested in. You've probably heard at one point or another an expression, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And that definitely applies here. Perfectionism is actually quite destructive to artistic creativity because perfectionism only teaches you how to frustrate yourself. It doesn't teach you how to make things better. So if you're obsessing about making sure that all of the details in your story and in your world line up and connect to each other and reinforce each other and create this perfect homeostatic whole, you're not going to get it. You're basically just going to find a way to ensure that you never complete anything. And I am speaking from experience here. There's a lot of stuff that I've started and never finished because I ran into that barrier where I said to myself, but how do I make this work? How do I make this work? And finally, I just gave up and waved my hands and said, then a miracle happens, and went on with the business of the story. And yes, maybe there would have been something that I could have found as a way to make things truly cohesive in the way I liked, but I couldn't see it then. I couldn't find out what it was in that moment. I just had to write that story, finish it, put it away, and then learn from the experience of doing so. Maybe later on I can take that experience and roll it into something that is more watertight and perfectly thought out. But at some point you have to draw a line, you have to plant a flag, you have to say, this is enough. I am enough. My story is going to be built on this. Everything after that, I just have to cross my fingers. And finally, if I haven't emphasized this strongly enough, not every audience member is going to be the kind of audience member you want on your side. They're not necessarily going to be your allies if the whole way that they relate to a story is by trying to figure out how to take it apart. There is room for genuine criticism in this world. There is room for people who are thoughtful and nuanced in their criticism, who try to look at things that don't make sense, but at the same time love them all the same. I'm not talking about people like that. I'm talking about people who basically go into a story with a chip on their shoulder for one reason or another. You have absolutely no obligation whatsoever to make those people happy, because they will never be happy. Make yourself happy first. Make yourself happy enough that you are willing and able to sit down and get about the business of putting the rest of your story together and making it sing. Don't try to make everybody happy. That's a great way to just make everybody miserable, especially you. So that's it with this thought. See what you think about it. I hope it helps.